thank you for writing this book. We'll just start there. And maybe I wanted to start with rewinding 2 weeks ago, or 2.5 weeks ago, when the first launch started to happen, when the book came out. You've been everywhere and you've been doing all these things, but how were you feeling? And I guess because, I mean, the real question is, what was your greatest fear? This is a very bold, very brave book. What was your greatest fear?
I would even rewind back to like 1.5 years ago. When I started to think about this book coming out and needing to promote it and needing to think about where I would position myself in the promotion, that's where I got really scared. I wasn't scared in the process of writing it or editing or anything like that. It was, well, I've been involved in this activism against khatna for 5 years now, but I've always been in the background. Like I've been on, steering committees, and I've been a Twitter handler, that kind of stuff. And then, but I really avoided the spotlight. I really avoided, stepping forward and saying, I too am a survivor, and, here are the issues. And I avoided that, I think, because I was still grappling. I was still healing at the time. And it took lots of thinking about it, and lots of therapy, and some practice interviews to be able to untangle, like, why couldn't I talk about it before? What was the shame? What was, what was all the trauma that had been, laden down around this? And so I did a lot of that work, and then it got more comfortable, and I started to see this quite differently. I started to see this as this really great opportunity to talk about this issue that is so shrouded in secrecy. Like really nobody talks about it in the community except for the activists. And in Canada, no one talks about this issue generally. So I just thought, like, oh, okay, so this is going to be a vehicle to start changing the conversation around this issue and normalizing conversations around this issue. And so now I'm quite grateful around it all. But initially I was really freaked out. Yeah.
And what does your healing look like? Can you describe that journey?
Yeah, it was a bunch of steps. Like, maybe about 4 years ago, I went to see a therapist, and I did some trauma healing just around understanding body memories and impacts on, I was having a lot of freeze reactions that I didn't understand. And then therapy also looked like the activism, and talking with, my fellow activists. Therapy looked like I went to an activists retreat in New York City that was run by a sister group of the group that I'm part of. And for the first time ever, I was in a room with 20 feminists from my own community. All the activism before that was very much online, and we would Skype each other and things like that. But for the first time, I was in a room with people from my own community who all identified as feminist, and probably 90% also identified as survivors. And so people were sharing stories. So that looked like healing too, because there were moments where, someone else was sharing a story and it was so like mine. And I was like, oh my God, now I can understand my story, And then it looked like as well, I returned to therapy in this past year and did inner child work. I did somatic experiencing therapy. So it was, trauma is so experienced in the body, and especially when you're really young and when it happens, so much of it is not in narrative memory as much, so this happened and this is where I was and this is who was there and this, you know, you don't have that. Some people have it, but a lot of people just dissociate. And so it's more like implicit, the trauma memories versus what we see in Hollywood. So it was just a lot of work with the body and body memory and making a cohesive narrative out of it all.
Because reading the book, I'm trying to imagine, I don't have this experience, and I'm trying to physically imagine this this procedure, this actually happening to women currently today, and you and the characters in the book. It's fiction inspired by true events, and you know, we're all of our characters and we're none of them. Yes. But and even I find it difficult to ask these questions, quite frankly. Your story of discovery, are you open to sharing your memories?
I don't tend to get into the direct trauma memories just because I feel like, you know, and yes, it's a safe space and all of that, but my inner child has often said no, and so I listen to that. But let me tell you what I can tell you, and I'll go systemic as well.
Mm-hmm. Please do.
So yeah, so you know, in my community, this is how it works. Around the age of 7, for me, it was when I was 4. Girls are taken to have khatna, and it's not a standardized procedure because it's done often by these amateurs, and even when it's done in a medical setting, and that's happening much more, doctors are actually doing it. The procedure is supposed to be about cutting the clitoral hood, and so sometimes more damage is done because, if you can imagine, that's a very delicate area, especially on a little person, right? And so one of the things that is important to know is that in my community, the people who are proponents of this, who believe that it is their religious right, because our high religious leader says it has to be done, they say it's not really FGM because it's so minimal. It's just this little nick. So sometimes it is just a little nick, and sometimes it's much more than that, depending on who's doing it and what is going on. And I would say that for most of the women I know, the biggest impact is psychological. It's akin to any kind of child sexual abuse that happens, where there's a lot of secrecy around it. You don't know what's happening. It's totally confusing. You get gaslit. You're told nothing actually happened to you. And then you're told to keep it a secret. So I think that's how people could probably understand it the best, is that it's this ritual that's done that is so like child sexual abuse. The other thing I'd like to just say about all this, because FGC is this thing that is like really thought to be from somewhere else and really weird, and makes us all really uncomfortable to talk about. But I like to say that it's on the continuum of gender-based violence that happens to girls and women and non-binary people across the globe, and it's not that different from rape culture or, you know, sexual harassment culture or any of the things that are there designed to control sexuality. And as we normalize these conversations, I think we're going to hear more and more how often it actually happens. Like, in the last 5 years, there's been all this activity amongst my community in India, and people in South India started to come forward. And in recent years, we've been hearing about women in Russia and in South America and all across Asia and the Middle East, as well as Africa. And 2 years ago, we started hearing about white Christian women in the US coming forward. So I think the more we normalize these conversations, the more we're going to understand that it's everywhere and it's all over the place. And
white Christian women?
White Christian women. So if it's amongst white Christians in the US, what about here? You know,
Performing khatna?
their own version of FGC.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Yeah. And it happens in different communities in different ways, of course, right? Not necessarily at age 7, and different kinds of cuts. Like khatna is considered to be one of the like least worst cuts. And then there's, you know, way worse forms where that damage much more tissue.
The least worst. I mean, it's yeah.
Oh, it's really terrible. But anyway, that's your big lecture on how it happens across the planet. So
Right. And so and it's tied to the religious beliefs and customs that somewhere along the line somebody thought this was a thing to do to girls.
sometimes it's connected to religion, and sometimes people feel like it's connected to culture more, because it happens across all different religions. And then, you know, the activists that I know are now saying, if we're going to tie it to culture, let's just tie it to the culture of the patriarchy, because, you know, none of our cultures should really want this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And you do that, and you bring that conversation out in the book so well just by these characters, because you've got these cousins, one on either side and then one in the middle, and everybody's coming at it from their own angle, because there's always more to one story, as well as you've got a 7-year-old girl at the time who says, and one of her lines is, how do you convince people it's wrong?
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. So I'll pose that back to you now. How do you convince people?
Yeah, I don't think you can convince the really, like, I don't think you can convince the proponents of it, but there is this big messy middle of people within my community who maybe have never thought about it. And I think that's how it's continued for such a long time. You're just told that it's nothing, and maybe you've got this internal confusion yourself about it, right? And it's considered to be a ritual that, you know, bonds you to the community. And maybe your mother-in-law or a grandmother or someone you don't want to offend is really pressuring you, and so you just continue doing it. So with this big middle group, I think one of the things we've really been trying to do is to talk about the harms, and to get people to grapple with the harms, that this isn't a harmless thing. And you know, we're told that it's about the religion, but there's actually nothing in the Quran that says that this should be done. So it's just a lot of education. Where there was once silence, I think we're trying to fill it with education so that people begin to think for themselves around it. One of the things that I wanted to write about in this book too, so Sharifa is a bit shut down with her sexuality, right? She hasn't ever had an orgasm, and she wonders why. And when she's trying to sort out some things, she asks herself like lots of questions about, like, am I really in charge of my sexuality? And I think that's something that lots and lots of us need to think about, because we're very much trained through like a heterosexist lens, first of all, about what our bodies are for. And it's also always like very other focused. Like very few of us have been trained that our bodies are for us and for our own pleasure and for our own play. Like they really belong to us for those things. Very few of us were taught that, and we might intellectually believe that, but do we enact that? I've recently created a partnership between We Speak Out and SciO for the Dear Masi column. And this is a column for anyone who has experienced FGC, who wants to write to Dear Masi for sex or relationship advice, because we don't talk about recovery very much. We talk about all of the nasty impacts, I think, because we're trying to educate people about the harms, but we're not talking about how people are healing and enjoying their sex lives and all of that. So that's, I think after finishing promoting this book, I think that's where I want my contribution to lie. I want to move out of the talking about the harms and talking about, so now what? You know? Yeah.
It's like when you teach, well, it's not like it, but it's when you critique some writing, you focus on the positive, not what's not working. You focus like more of the good stuff, right? To move forward, right? Because yeah, that's a very positive way to look at it.
And I think it might help survivors as well who aren't able to think about it or talk about it to start to enter the issue differently, because if they can be like, oh, we have sex lives. Oh, like, look at this funny relationship column. Oh, like, maybe if there's a little bit more lightness and joy around it, it'll help other survivors just even talk about it.
Mm-hmm. And see the example, right? You can't, if you don't talk about it, nobody's talking about it. So if you can't see it.
Yes.
You can't see it, you can't be it, right? They need role models. Well, I think that, I mean, it's remarkable how you've given the reader a way in to this dark subject, so sensitive, so intimate, so shrouded in secrecy. It's really truly an accomplishment.
Oh, thank you. I hope it was fun too. I hope it was fun.
Yeah.
Fun.
And a quick read. I want to say it's very readable. Like, that sounds like diminishing it, but it is a page turner. I haven't been able to read since COVID hit. My attention span has been nil, and I was like, 400 pages. How am I going to get through it? But it's a great story. We're not going to talk about the ending, but when writers talk to other writers about endings to books, which is very hard for the authors on this call, it's endings are hard.
Endings are, yeah, they
sorry?
They take a lot of writing and rewriting to get them, good.
Oh, well, that was a question. So I'm just going to say one thing about the ending, that it is what we talk about is we want it to be the only way it could have ended, but also unexpected. Like, you nailed it. It's incredible. About the craft, I wanted to ask, was there, in your revisions when you're working with the editor, was there anything that stayed, that went? Was it going a different direction and they helped you shape it? Was there anything you had to fight for?
I did a lot of early work with Rachel Lutovsky, my agent. She's amazing. Like, if any of you have agents, like, it's so good to have an agent who does editorial support. Not all of them do. And one of the things that she encouraged me to put in were the Abdulali threads. So the great-great-grandfather comes in periodically with little episodes from his life. And initially I hadn't written that, I think, or I hadn't written much. I can't remember if I'd written any of it so long ago, but she really encouraged me to flesh that out. And I think I had written I'd written it in a different form. That's what it was. And she was like, get it in there and like make it really present. So she helped me. She also helped me with the ending.